Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the next video in the Electoral Systems series. Today we have open list proportional. I will make a note to head off some comments. I'm not doing closed list proportional. It is used, but to me, because it is a closed list, it is worse than F tier. It is just unconscionable that someone would use it because the voter has no control over the representative. You can only blindly guess. Now, there's some arguments, pros and cons. You can put them in the comments below if you disagree or not, but to me, it is just such unconscionable to remove all choice from the voter on who actually represents them that it's a terrible system in my opinion. But we'll focus on open list, which does not have that problem. So how does open list proportional work? So every voter gets one vote, and each party has a list of candidates from 1 to the number of seats. Each voter votes for a candidate of the party, and those candidates are then, depending on the system, there's some rules on it, there might be some minimum votes needed, will win seats in order of their votes. Now, some systems have it so that the party will list all their candidates from their preferred order, and if they get above a certain threshold, they'll move up the list. Depends on the system. There's a huge variety in open list systems, but the general idea is voters can vote for a candidate of the party, and that increases their rank. There's a minimum vote share to get seats for a party. It's typically 1 to 5%. Depends on the system. 5 is very common, though not exclusively. Now, every party who gets above that minimum number of seat or vote share is given seats proportionally, and they are given the candidates of the party get seat in order that was determined by voting preferences. So, in other words, the ideal system, in my mind, you would vote for a candidate. So you'd have your ballot, you'd have all the parties and all the candidates on it of the party. In some places like Sweden, they give you multiple ballots, but you get them all at the same time, so there's still confidentiality. And you vote for the candidate you like the best from that party. That vote counts to the whole party, and that vote also increases the likelihood that that candidate gets a seat from that party's seat total. So how does this track up against the criteria we have selected? So majority winner, candidate-wise, open systems are effectively kind of like multi-winner, first past the post in this regard. So by definition, voting for, if a candidate has a majority of the votes, they will be at the top of the system, or top of the list. There is some, again, specificity depending on the list system, but this is generally true. Party-wise, a party that has more than 50% of the vote is obviously going to get more than 50% of the seats. That's just by definition. Majority loser, kind of the inverse of the last one. If the majority of people prefer every other candidate on a list, then this candidate, they're going to be at the bottom of the list. And, well, you cannot win more votes than you have vote share, so if a majority of people prefer every other party, you do not win as a party. Contest winner, this doesn't really count because it only really affects for ranked voting or particular candidates. Doesn't really hold true with proportional system. Monotone, voting for a non-preferred candidate on a list or a preferred candidate in general cannot in any way affect the party. Very similar to the first past the post proof for this, so I didn't duplicate it. If you really want to see that proof, you can go look at the first past the post video. It is effectively the same thing, because again, this is effectively first past the post, but multi-winner. Consistency, this is trivial because the proportionality of a system is not affected by scale, with the one asterisk of vote share cutoff. But that said, even with that caveat, actually, that's still not even true, because if you have two subdivisions that return the exact same result, that means that they have the same proportions, so a combination will have the same proportion. So this is always true. This is kind of an irrelevant thing in proportional, so in the other systems, this was a very important criteria, but proportional systems like this, it's basically a non-factor because it's just trivially true, but also almost never happens. Let me rephrase this. It's almost impossible for two areas to return the same vote share. So this is just irrelevant. Though it is always true, that said, that if they did return the same vote share, their combination would be the same. So participation, I have a typo there, but whatever. Trivially true as well. So parties win by proportion, and candidates move up the list in a preferred order based on vote share. So increasing the vote share in either case will always benefit the voter's preferences. Again, trivially true. Later no harm, doesn't apply, no ranking. Later no hope, doesn't apply, no ranking. Different tiers of members, there's a single tier, it's the party list level. Resistance to government change. Now this is where it gets tricky, because proportional systems take coalition building from pre-election and they make it post-election. In generally speaking, you're going to have many parties in a proportional system. There's no easy way to estimate it, but generally speaking, the lower the threshold, the more parties there's going to be. Not strictly true, but generally. Generally, you'll have like two versions of this, where you'll have either two big parties with like 4 or 6 to 6 other smaller parties, or you'll have like, there's 3. The second variant is you have like 5 or 6 medium parties and a bunch of small parties, and then there's one meaningful party. The third one, is there's one big party and there's a bunch of other progressively smaller parties as you get further from that. So like, you'll have 1 big, 2 medium, 2 sort of small, a bunch of tiny. The Netherlands falls in category 3, for example. Italy falls into category 2, for example. And for the most part, Sweden falls into category 1, though it's not quite a nice fit in category 1. The tricky thing here with proportional systems, though, is since coalitions are almost entirely needed, again, there are some specific caveats depending on the system, such as Sweden, you form government by not getting voted down, so you don't need it's a negative confidence versus an affirmative confidence. If that it's finicky, but in cases like Sweden, you don't actually need a majority to govern parliament. You just need a majority to not disagree with you to govern, which is a strange thing, but yeah, it is. But in a general system that requires majority for governing coalition and not a majority approval and not majority disapproval. Again, I can go into further detail in a footnote on that one, but let me know in the comments if you want that. But if you needed majority approval to form government, you effectively need to have a coalition that is 50% plus 1 of seats. So in a case here where we have 6 parties, and we have this order A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or E, F, with it being in this, how easy they work together. So A works better with B, works better with B than C, then D, then E, and F. So A and F basically don't work together at all. C and D work fine. B and C work fine. B and D work okay. That kind of thing. So in a situation like this, which is almost always true, though in principle you could theoretically have a circle and not a line. I don't know if there's a case of that happening, but it's not necessarily impossible. There's no reason it couldn't happen. Then you'll have some parties form a coalition. In this case, we'll have A, B, and C. So in principle, if this is the case, only one seat needs to change, so you only need 1 over the number of seats. So if you have 300 seats, you only need 1 over 300% of the vote change in order to change who the new coalition is going to be. However, the problem with this in-principle idea is, let's take this example. Let's say A loses a seat and D gains a seat. So now they swap A out of the coalition for D. So now you have BCD instead of ABC. The problem with this is that that's not really a new government. Because assuming, in this case, that these 6 parties are roughly the same vote share, 2/3 of the government is the same as it was before. And in particular, in situations that you get in places like the Netherlands, where you have one party that is much larger than the others, relatively speaking, considering how many parties there are in the Netherlands, it can be the case that the Prime Minister can stay in power for a very long time, but his coalition, or her coalition, changes every single election, because the parties forming coalition with them change vote share every election. But they can stay in power for a very long time because they're the largest party. It's easier if that party's more towards the political center, because there's more room to coalition, unless you are in the mythical place where you have a circle, a political circle instead of political line. But generally, people are in political lines because, I mean, let's be real, when is a libertarian and a communist going to agree on anything? So, in this regard, there is actually no deterministic way to replace a government if you want the entire cabinet to be changed. If you are a person who wants to see every single government minister replaced by someone new, there is no deterministic way that the populace can vote to do that, barring the parties in government just completely collapsing. You see this in Italy all the time, where the party in government goes from having like 20% vote share to like 5%. Not all the time, I suppose. It has happened a couple times where the governing party loses a ton of vote share. In that regard, then it's theoretically possible that you could see the whole cabinet changed. But in practice, it is very difficult, if not nearly impossible, to see the whole cabinet changed, because there's just so many parties people can vote to, and coalition formation afterwards is a second order decision from what the voter does. So just because someone switched their vote, let's say from party C to party D, in order to try to get C out of coalition, doesn't actually mean C will leave coalition, because it could very well be the case that instead of having A in the coalition, now you have B, C, D. And this is where it gets very complicated, and this is really the biggest weakness of proportional systems. There is just no, in almost all cases, there is no clear or obvious way to replace the government as a voter. There's no clear decision making you can do. We look back at instant runoff voting, for example. The clear choice is, if you do not like the current government, you vote for one of the opposition parties, and that is more likely to cause a government to fail. In the case of proportional system, if you were voting for the government and you no longer like them, in this case ABC, and you vote for D or E, you could still very well end up with the same prime minister. If the prime minister is coming from C, and you switched your vote from B to E, you could very well get a CDE coalition. And C still holds the prime minister. So it can be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for you as a voter, or many people as voters, to figure out what to do, barring the offending minister's party just disintegrating. I hope this makes sense. I can put a footnote on this with like real-world examples if people want. Let me know in the comments below. We'll move on to the next stage. So, difficulty to form government. So, depends on the exact threshold. Typically, there's 5 to 10 parties. In the case of the Netherlands, I believe there's 17. that had relevant vote shares, that should say. Coalitions are almost entirely needed, though again you have places like Sweden where there's not really a formal government coalition because of how their confidence rules work in their government, but again, it is what it is. So the best case scenario in this regard is it's trivial to form a coalition. Real world example, this last Dutch election, it was pretty trivial to form that coalition government following. There was, I want to say 4 parties involved, but they had a pretty easy deal. They had to replace, I think, one of their previous coalition partners, someone else, to make the majority, but it was pretty trivial. The worst case scenario is you get a situation like Belgium had between 2007 and 2011, where they could not form a government because their parliament was split heavily between the Flemish Nationalist Party, I can't think of its name, and a socialist party. The Flemish Nationalists, being one of the only nationalist groups in Europe who are right-wing, are very right-wing. That's a whole other video, but it's kind of weird. Most nationalist groups in Europe are left-wing, like the Scottish Nationalists, Catalans, etc. So in the case of Belgium here, the Flemish Separatist Party and the Walloon Socialist Party completely disagreed on almost everything, both on politics, on whether Belgium should exist, and, well, language policies, which are a relatively big deal in Belgium. And because of how the result worked out, it was effectively impossible to form a majority government without both of them in it. I don't know if it was actually impossible, but I guess like de jure, but it de facto was, likely because of smaller parties' ideological tilts. If you had a small libertarian party, it'd be very difficult for them to form a coalition with a socialist party. So in the case there, you had 4 years and had to have another entire election before the government formation was solved, and even after that election, it still took quite a while. And this is the big problem with proportional system, because the way it works out, that if you have 2 very diametrically opposed factions in your country, you can regularly get situations where the government can't be formed. This is not true in countries that have a lot of unity, such as Sweden, but if you have a very divisive divide in your country, such as Belgium, it can be extremely difficult to form governments, or not as divisive, but still difficult for the government, situations like Italy, where for various reasons they throw out their government leaders pretty regularly these days. I believe the average lifespan is 2 years for a government, for a prime minister right now. It can see a lot of very rapid change in governments because there's so many parties that it's very easy for a new coalition to occur, even without an election occurring. Whereas, if you compare this to a first-past-the-post system, even a Westminster first-past-the-post system, typically, if a government fails a confidence vote, they are followed by an election. Whereas, in a proportional system, since there are many more parties, it is conceivable that a government could lose a confidence vote and a new one can form without a new election occurring. Is this a bad thing? Not strictly speaking, but it's also not strictly speaking a good thing. It just kind of exists. Some people like it, some people don't like it. I personally do not like it, but I would accept someone liking it. It's just different kettles of fish. Flavors of the pie? Whatever. So where does this put proportional? Openlist proportional. Well, openlist proportional is solidly in B tier. There is a lot to like about it. I do like that compared to closed list, you can vote for your preferred candidate. I also think it does do its main point extremely well. It is very proportional. my definition. The big issue to me, which holds back from A tier, is it just doesn't satisfy, to me, the ease of forming government. I'm going to rephrase that. Not the ease of forming government. The ease of changing government. It can be almost impossible for any particular voter to know how to vote in order to change the incumbent government. Strategic voting exists in this system because there are voting thresholds, but there is not much strategic voting in forming government, which some people tout as a good thing. I personally think it is a bad thing because there can be a lot of cases where you just do not want the current government to continue. And while it is not the best way to vote, it is a legitimate way to vote. I do not think you should vote like that, but I think it is bad if the system is like that, because there can be a situation, hypothetically, that the government is led by very corrupt people, and you just want anyone else in power. In proportional, that is very difficult. Strictly open list proportional, it's very difficult. Again, not impossible, but very difficult. And the other issue too, which I personally holds it back for me, is the fact that it creates so many parties, makes it very complicated for voters to vote, because a lot of these will be single issue parties. A lot of these will be very similar, but slightly different parties. Again, in the Netherlands, there are I think 4. I believe it's 4 different populist right-wing parties. How do you know which one to vote for in that regard? I don't know. If I'm a Dutch audience member, maybe you can enlighten me. And there's presumably similar numbers of left-wing parties as well. I use populist right-wing ones as an example because that was a big deal recently. There was the one that exploded into 3. But you don't watch these videos for Dutch politics. So I'll wrap this up here. If you like this video, obviously please like, share, subscribe, comment below what you think. If you disagree with me, if you would rate this higher yourself, let me know. Otherwise, I hope you all have a good day.